My brother-in-law asked me one question at a family lunch, and I didn't speak to him for 2 months afterward. I'm Trevor, 66, from Cardiff. He asked whether I'd ever actually seen her properly on a video call. A reasonable question. A question, frankly, any sensible person would have asked a lot sooner than month 9. I told him the connection out there wasn't always reliable. He said that sounded like an excuse. I got angrier with him than the comment warranted. The kind of disproportionate anger that, looking back, tells you everything about what's actually going on underneath it. I want to be honest from the start, because I think it matters more than the money does. I knew somewhere underneath everything, fairly early on, that something wasn't quite right. I want you to understand that going in, because I think most people watching this assume the men in these stories are simply naive, simply taken in completely, never suspecting a thing until the end. That wasn't me. I suspected plenty. I just couldn't make myself stop, and that's a different and in some ways worse thing to admit. I'd been divorced 18 months when this started. 41 years married, the kind of marriage that ends not with a single dramatic event, but with a slow accumulation of separateness until one day you're sharing a house with someone you used to know rather well. My wife Pamela and I parted on reasonably civil terms, all things considered, though civil isn't the same as easy. Our 2 daughters were grown and settled with their own families, both supportive in the practical sense, neither of them particularly equipped to fill the specific hole that 41 years of shared evenings leaves behind in a man's life. I'd taken up gardening properly in retirement, the way men of my generation do, when the structure of work disappears and something has to take its place. I joined a Facebook group for amateur gardeners, started posting photographs of what I'd grown, found a small community of people who seemed to genuinely care whether my dahlias had come through the frost. It felt good, that small attention. I won't pretend otherwise. A woman commented on a photograph I'd posted of a particularly good display of sweet peas. Her name, or the name she used, was Mai. Her profile said she was from Chiang Mai, 48 years old, ran a small flower export business, which felt like a charming and entirely plausible reason for a Thai woman to be interested in a retired Welshman's garden photographs. She said the colours were beautiful, asked what variety I'd grown, and I answered, the way you do, not thinking anything of it at all. She commented again on the next photograph, and the one after that. Within a fortnight she'd sent a private message, something small and unremarkable about a gardening technique, and I'd replied, and that was the beginning of what became, over the following 14 months, the most intense relationship of my adult life, conducted entirely through a phone screen, with a woman I never once met, never once spoke to on a video call with her face fully visible for longer than a few seconds at a time. Always some excuse, always some reason the connection was poor, or the lighting was bad, or she was too shy. I want to describe what those messages were like, because I think this is the part people who haven't experienced it struggle to understand. They weren't generic. They weren't the obvious, clumsy, scripted messages you might imagine. Mai remembered everything. She remembered my daughters' names, remembered which one was going through a difficult patch with her own marriage, asked after her specifically weeks later, with what felt like genuine concern. She remembered Pamela's name and never once said anything unkind about the divorce, just listened, in the way good listening reads even through text, with questions that showed she'd actually absorbed what I'd told her, rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. She sent me photographs, dozens of them, over the months. Standing in front of flower displays she said were from her business, sitting in restaurants. Once a video, quite short, maybe 15 seconds, of her walking through what she said was a market in Chiang Mai. Her face turned slightly away from the camera the whole time because she said she hated how she looked on video, which at the time felt like an endearing insecurity rather than what it almost certainly was, which was a careful avoidance of ever showing a face clearly enough to be reverse image searched or properly scrutinized. The first request for money came around month 4, and I want to be precise about how it arrived, because the manner mattered enormously to how I responded. She didn't ask directly. She mentioned, almost in passing, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary conversation about something else entirely, that a shipment of flowers for an important export order had been held at customs because of a paperwork fee she hadn't budgeted for. Something relatively small, the equivalent of about £200. She said it the way you'd mention any minor inconvenience to someone you trusted, not as a plea, almost as if she were thinking aloud. I offered before she'd asked anything of me directly. That became the pattern for the entire 14 months. She would describe a problem. I would offer. She would every single time initially refuse, say she couldn't possibly accept, that she'd find another way. And I would insist, and eventually, with what always read as genuine reluctance, she would accept. I knew, even then, somewhere underneath the warmth of being needed, that the precise choreography of that exchange was suspicious. A part of me clocked it as a pattern almost immediately. The refuse then accept structure, repeating with a consistency that a less besotted man would have caught within the second or third occurrence. I caught it. I noticed it. I kept sending the money anyway, because by that point the relationship itself, the daily messages, the feeling of being thought about by someone first thing in the morning and last thing at night had become something I couldn't make myself walk away from, even with my own suspicion sitting quietly in the back of my mind the entire time. I think that's the thing nobody warns you about with this particular kind of scam. It isn't that you don't see it. It's that seeing it doesn't necessarily stop you, because by the time you've seen it clearly enough to name it, the daily contact has become its own habit, its own need, separate almost entirely from whether you believe the story being told to you. I was 65 years old, alone in a house that had echoed with someone else's presence for 4 decades, and a phone buzzing with good morning messages and remembered details about my daughters had become, regardless of what I suspected about its sincerity, the best part of most of my days. The amounts grew steadily over those 14 months. The customs fee. Then a problem with a business loan repayment. Then, around month 7, her mother needed a medical procedure that the local hospital wouldn't perform without payment up front. A story constructed with exactly the right amount of specific, plausible detail. A hospital name, a procedure name I had to look up afterward and discovered was indeed a real and genuinely serious condition, which only made the whole thing feel more credible at the time. I sent £1,400 for that one alone. By month 10 I had started keeping a private note on my phone, a running total. Not because I intended to stop, I want to be honest about that, but because some careful ledger-keeping part of me needed to see the number written down somewhere, even while the rest of me kept adding to it. I look back at that note now and find it almost unbearably sad. This quiet evidence that I knew exactly what was happening to me in real time, and documented it anyway, like a man recording his own slow drowning. Around month 11 I properly tried, to end it. I told her I needed some space, that the pace of everything felt like too much, which was a half-truth wrapped around the real fear I couldn't quite say aloud, which was that I suspected she wasn't who she claimed to be at all. She didn't push back aggressively. She did something far more effective. She went quiet for 4 days, no messages at all, the longest silence in the entire relationship, and I discovered, to my genuine horror, how completely unmoored I felt by the absence. How many times an hour I checked my phone. How the silence itself became a kind of evidence in my mind that the relationship must be real, because surely a scam wouldn't risk losing a mark by withdrawing rather than escalating. She came back on the 5th day with a message that said simply that she'd needed time to think, that she cared about me too much to keep accepting my generosity, that perhaps I was right and we should slow down. I replied within minutes telling her I'd missed her terribly and that nothing needed to change. The withdrawal had worked exactly as, I now understand, it was designed to work. The final amount, the one that finally broke whatever fragile equilibrium I'd been maintaining between suspicion and devotion, came in month 13. A business opportunity, she said, a chance to invest in expanding her flower export operation into a second city, an investment that would. She explained with figures and projections that looked entirely reasonable. Pay back several times over within 2 years, and give us, she said, the foundation for a life together once I finally came to visit, which she'd been gently delaying for the entire 14 months with reasons that always sounded sensible at the time and look, collectively, absurd in hindsight. I sent £11,000 for that single investment, the largest single payment of the entire relationship, transferred to an account that, when I finally had a fraud specialist look into it months later, had received similar transfers from what appeared to be at least 6 other men, all around my age, all over roughly the same period. The pattern obvious once someone with actual expertise looked at it properly, instead of a lonely man looking at it through hope. The messages stopped completely 2 weeks after that final transfer. Not a gradual fade this time, not a withdrawal designed to draw me back in. Simply nothing. The account remained visible for a few more weeks, still posting occasional photographs, still appearing active, before it vanished from the platform entirely, along with every message history, every photograph, every small remembered detail about my daughters that I'd mistaken for genuine care. £43,000, accumulated in instalments small enough that no single one felt catastrophic at the time, only catastrophic in total. The way debt or illness accumulates quietly until the day you're finally forced to look at the whole of it at once. I want to say something about the daughters now, because I think it's the part of this that still sits heaviest. I told my elder daughter eventually, about 8 months after it had ended, because she'd noticed I was different, quieter, and pushed gently, until I told her everything. She didn't react with anger, which I'd braced myself for. She cried, actually, and said the thing that has stayed with me more than almost anything else from the entire ordeal. She said, "Dad, I wish you'd told me you were that lonely, rather than, I wish you hadn't sent the money." I think about that distinction often. The money was the visible damage. The loneliness underneath it was the actual wound, and nobody, including me, had been paying proper attention to that until it had already cost me everything it was going to cost. If you are 60, 70, recently widowed or divorced, and someone online has started remembering the small details of your life with a warmth that feels like exactly what's been missing, I would ask you to consider this. Not whether she's real, because I think on some level many of us already suspect the answer to that and continue anyway, the way I did. Ask instead whether you would be sending this money to a stranger if the daily messages stopped tomorrow, regardless of the outcome. If the answer is no, if the money is genuinely tied to keeping the contact alive rather than to any rational assessment of the situation in front of you, that itself is the warning, clearer than any photograph or any inconsistency in a story ever could be. I never met Mai. I'm not even certain that was ever her real name, or that the woman in those carefully angled photographs and that 15-second video had anything at all to do with whoever was actually typing those messages to me each morning. £43,000 bought me 14 months of feeling thought about by someone every single day, at an age when I had quietly stopped expecting anyone to think about me much at all. I'm not sure, even now, which part of that I regret more. There's a particular evening I keep returning to when I try to explain this to myself, because I think it captures something about how completely the daily rhythm of it took hold of me. It was a Tuesday, ordinary in every way, and I'd had a perfectly pleasant afternoon at my allotment. The kind of afternoon that should have left me content rather than anxious. But I'd left my phone in the car by mistake, and for the 2.5 hours I was without it, I found myself increasingly distracted, checking my pocket out of habit every few minutes, working out in my head what time it would be in Chiang Mai, and whether she'd have sent her usual midday message, and whether she'd notice I hadn't replied, and whether that silence on my end would read, to her, as the beginning of me pulling away. I drove home faster than I needed to. I want you to understand that this wasn't infatuation in the giddy sense people associate with new romance. This was something closer to dependency, a need to check, to confirm, to maintain, that had crept up on me so gradually I hadn't noticed it arriving until it was already fully installed in how I structured my days. My allotment, incidentally, became something of a secondary relationship through all of this, in a strange way. I'd photograph things there specifically to send to her, choosing angles, waiting for good light, in a way I'd never once done purely for myself. Looking back, I think part of what kept me hooked was that she made me feel like a more interesting version of myself than I actually believed I was. Pamela, in our last years together, had stopped really looking at what I grew. Mai asked questions about soil pH and companion planting that suggested genuine knowledge, or at least genuine research into things she knew would matter to me, which amounts to nearly the same thing in terms of the effect it has on a lonely man. I should say more about how the relationship escalated in tone as well as in financial terms, because I think the romantic content of it is what made the financial requests so much harder to interrogate properly. By month 6, we were exchanging what I can only describe as love letters, lengthy messages late at night about what life might look like if I eventually came to Thailand, if she eventually came to Wales. Plans neither of us seriously expected to execute imminently, but that both of us, or at least I, found genuinely comforting to imagine in detail. She described a small house she pictured us having. She asked whether I'd mind the heat, whether my garden could be replicated somehow in a different climate, small specific questions at 2 a.m, as evidence of a woman actually planning a future rather than simply maintaining a performance. I mentioned that lunch with Jeffrey at the start of this, the question, the anger, the 2 months of silence that followed. What I didn't tell you yet is what was actually happening underneath that anger, because at the time I couldn't have explained it properly myself. It wasn't really about Jeffrey doubting Mai. It was about Jeffrey doubting a version of my own life that I needed, by that point, to keep believing in. He was blunt to the point of rudeness, always had been, and the question itself was fair, obviously fair, the kind of question any sensible outsider would ask. But by month 9 I wasn't capable of hearing it as a fair question. I could only hear it as a threat to the one part of my week that still felt like it mattered. The investment request in month 13, the £11,000, deserves more detail than I gave it, because the manner of that particular ask was different from everything before it, more elaborate, more clearly the work of someone experienced in exactly this kind of escalation. She sent me what looked like a proper business proposal document, several pages. Projected costs for leasing a second shop space, supplier agreements, even what appeared to be a simple profit and loss projection over 3 years. I showed it, I'm slightly ashamed to admit, to nobody at all, because some part of me already suspected what a more objective set of eyes would say about it, and I didn't want to hear that yet. I wanted, for just a little longer, to be a man whose girlfriend in Thailand was building something real, something he was helping fund, rather than something that was funding nothing but a continued sense of connection. I transferred that money on a Thursday evening, I remember, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside me, reading her message of gratitude 3 or 4 times over before I went to bed, feeling, genuinely feeling, useful and needed and significant in a way I hadn't felt since long before the divorce. I think that feeling, more than any single lie she told me, is the actual product these operations are selling. The money is just the mechanism. What they're really providing, for however long they choose to provide it, is the specific and increasingly rare experience for a man my age of mattering to someone on a daily basis. When the messages stopped completely, 2 weeks after that final transfer, I want to describe what those first few days were actually like, because I think it matters for anyone watching this who might be in the middle of something similar right now and doesn't yet have the word ending attached to what's happening to them. I check my phone, I'm not exaggerating, every 15 or 20 minutes for the first 3 days. The same compulsive checking from that afternoon at the allotment, but now with no allotment to distract from it. Just empty hours and a phone that stayed stubbornly silent. I told myself repeatedly that there must be a reasonable explanation, a problem with her phone, a family emergency, anything other than the explanation that was, by day 4, becoming impossible to keep avoiding. I eventually paid for a fraud specialist to look properly into the account I'd been transferring money to, which is how I learned about the other men. At least 6 identifiable through similarly timed and similarly structured transfers, though the specialist told me there were almost certainly more whose transfers had gone through other channels entirely untraceable to that particular account. I think about those other men sometimes, strangers I'll never meet, each of us believing, with what felt like complete certainty at the time, that we were the only one she was waiting for. If you are 60, 70, recently widowed or divorced, and someone online has started remembering the small details of your life with a warmth that feels like exactly what's been missing, I would ask you to consider this, not whether she's real, because I think on some level many of us already suspect the answer to that and continue anyway, the way I did. Ask instead whether you would be sending this money to a stranger if the daily messages stop tomorrow, regardless of the outcome. If the answer is no, if the money is genuinely tied to keeping the contact alive rather than to any rational assessment of the situation in front of you, that itself is the warning, clearer than any photograph or any inconsistency in a story ever could be.